Yeah, something.
All right. You might have seen earlier today there was Greg Cable who spoke on skepticism, and you might have heard me heckling him a little bit. And the point of that was that I think he was being too soft on skepticism. That basically, skeptics, in my view, and I want to put this out for you to consider, should be skeptical in all things, not just in some things, and then choose to believe others. So one of the things I challenged him on was definitions. But let's go back to his diagram. He had a nice little diagram of his wonderful bell-shaped curve that academics absolutely love and want to apply to all things, regardless of whether they make sense or not. And he had provable and unprovable. Now, Stephen Jay Gould, who some of you may be familiar with, talked about, was it overlapping magisterium? That there's things that science applies to and things that it doesn't. And I disagree. And I'm not the only one who does. So I think this is the same sort of divide, saying that, well, you know, we don't have to bother with all these traditional supernatural beliefs because, unlike the supernatural beliefs which we should be bothered with, they're completely different because they're traditional. And they fit into the unprovable, or they fit into this other magisterium that science can't apply to, so we don't have to worry about them. And I think, you know, if we want to be big K skeptics, then we're cheating. If you don't apply skepticism to everything, including your skepticism, then you're not being properly skeptical, you're just playing with it. You're being critical about the things it's fun to be critical with, other people's beliefs, and you're not being critical about your own beliefs. So, for example, we went on about, in the earlier session, if you didn't see it, there was definition of belief. Should you have beliefs in things? And the idea was, well, in this case, you go for the evidence and you choose science. And you have a conditional belief in things. You don't know about, you know gravity happens, but you don't know that it's always going to happen. You don't know why it happens. And there's competing theories. And there's facts. Unprovable things you can choose to believe. And he included God in that. And my question was, what does belief mean? Now, if you speak to the faithful, the religious people, they will tell you belief means you absolutely know something with all your heart, with all your... There is no room for doubt. You know something completely. It's absolute certainty. And I think that's a wrong philosophy. That's a wrong way to encounter the world. And I think even if in the domain of things that have been proved, that's still wrong. What science, I think, is telling us is to let go of certainty. That we can live without it. It's really, you know, it's nice, it's comfortable, it's safe, but we don't need it. And we can let it go. So he took people to choose to believe in God. And of course, when you say that phrase, he's not just saying, he's got a whole bundle of cultural things that have come with it. When you say God, are you talking about a God? Are you talking about the God of the Judeo-Christian religion? Or what do you mean? And he wasn't willing to be drawn out on what a belief was or what a God was. And I find most people aren't, particularly gods. Like what is a God? You can look it up in a book of mythology. It has to be something with a personality. So you can't have just a magical thing. There's a magical object isn't God. So it has to actually have some personality and agency. And it has to be able to do things that other things can't do. So my question for religious people might be, is a wizard a god? Because if you can do magic, if you can do supernatural things beyond what technology can currently do and what science tells us is possible, which seems to be a good definition of what magic is supposed to be, then does it make you a god? Because you're above nature. If you can live a long time, if you can live forever, if you can raise people from the dead, like what does it take? And I think you really have to define this very carefully, because otherwise we don't know what we're talking about. So people say you can't prove God doesn't exist, have to say what they mean by that phrase God. Do they mean the God of the Bible, in which case, easy. You can look at the world and you can say the world doesn't match that description. If you model that, you don't get the And you can do that with any religion that humans have invented so far. It's only when you don't define the word that you can't debate whether or not it's true. And I think, look, Dave Happy Singer brought up relationships, which is where the word faith is often brought in. And in relationships, as he pointed out, you can have a conditional belief in something. So I think there's two types of belief. There's true belief, which is absolute certainty in something without a need for proof, or with or without proof, really. It doesn't matter. It's an absolute certainty. Or you can have a conditional probabilistic belief. So you might have a 98% belief that you think is kind of right, but you're willing to be proved wrong. Now, along with this philosophy, I think, is that you've got to have, as well as letting go of certainty, you've got to be happy about it. So if somebody proves you wrong, something that you've been pretty certain for a long time, reasonably certain, it's a good thing because now you know a better truth. And truth is more important than being right. And that's an attitude that a lot of people have trouble taking on, particularly if you've been raised in a tradition where you're pretty sure you're right, and if you're bright enough that your arguments are really good and you're often very right. To let go when you get better evidence or a better argument can be a bit hard, but once you're used to it, once you let go of the certainty and let go of that selfish, wonderful feeling of being right, then you can embrace greater truths if somebody shows you a better argument or better facts or better evidence. Now, he talked about superstring theory, and superstring theory is this abstruse area of science, and he described basically the mathematics of the standard model and the supergravity and all the other things that we're trying to work out, the limits of where physics currently understands the world. It's ugly mathematics, and people think, for no particularly good reason, that the mathematics should be beautiful, so they invented string theory, which is beautiful. And because there's no way to prove string theory, even in principle, there's no way to test it. Now, he thinks you should be allowed to believe string theory is true. But I think it doesn't matter. Like, as a skeptic, there is no point in believing or disbelieving something that can't be proved even in principle. Like, if it doesn't affect the world, like he was talking about invisible pink dragons, or anything. If you can't see it here, if it doesn't affect the world in any way, shape or form, and some deists will say that their particular god is like that. It's invisible, it doesn't affect the material world in any way, shape or form, you can't pray to it, you can't do this, you can't do that. Well, okay, so if it doesn't affect anything and you can't detect it, then it may as well not exist. So how should you behave? Well, I think if you've got a probabilistic way of substituting for belief, then you can act as if you believe in certain things until it no longer makes sense to, or as the evidence changes your probabilistic weightings. But you don't necessarily trust something. If it's only 50-50, you want to trust it as much as if it's 80-20 or something else. So let's see if I've got a little bit of time left. So I think a lot of skeptics play with skepticism, but don't apply it to absolutely everything. And it doesn't just apply to the supernatural. Like during the recent Japanese nuclear disaster following the earthquake, I saw a lot of tweets from people I know are skeptics and are very hard on people who go against science or promote the supernatural, that were absolutely sunlight and rainbows about nuclear power. And when I clicked on their links and checked, they obviously hadn't put the skeptical work into checking the source of the information that confirmed their previously held belief that nuclear power was a nice option to polluting the world with coal and oil. And it just doesn't hold up. So they're either saying that things are all hunky-dory and they're taking it straight from the nuclear industry, or they're just all quoting the same article a million times without any way ever checking what the facts are. I do a science podcast, Diffusion, and I try and search all these out. So I'm doing a story on thorium-based nuclear reactors at the moment, because it turns out all the pro stories don't carry the full facts that people should be asking questions about. So they'll say that the nuclear waste gets eaten up in a few hundred years instead of in hundreds of thousands like regular ones. But I can't, so far, I've still doing the research to find how that happens. I can't find the reaction. But why hasn't everyone else asked this question? Well, because it confirms their bias that there's an option, that there's not despair in the world. We don't have a lack of baseload power, and we don't have to wait for solar power. So be sceptical about your skepticism.
5 minutes for questions, if you want.
Yes? Questions, anybody?
Yeah, the nature of like scientific fact itself is kind of evolutionary. So I was wondering, like, you speak of being skeptical on everything. Do you yourself kind of believe, I want to use the word, in scientific fact, or how do you mediate? Are you completely free-floating in your consciousness, or do you actually have cemented ideologues?
Okay, I try to be free-floating because I read a lot of scientific information every day. So I read the blogs, I read the websites, I read the papers, I read the journals and magazines, and TV, radio, whatever. So a lot of claims are made, and you don't know until you check the paper, and if it's been peer-reviewed, there hasn't been mistakes. For example, a paper came out that I wanted to talk about that I haven't had time to study by, I think it's Richard Ben, B-E-M, and he's claiming evidence for precognition. And the irony is that this paper was actually disputed before it was ever published. And nobody seemed to see the irony of that. And it's been massively peer-reviewed now, like more reviewed than any normal paper. But it got published because it passed that review. His peers really want to rip it to shreds, and they're really good. He's got a track record of publishing good papers, so he's not some maverick from nowhere. They're all really good. They really know he's wrong, they're sure he's wrong, but they can't find anything in his methodology, his analysis, his statistics. They just don't like his conclusions. But they can't fault him, and they really want to. So the only logical way to progress scientifically is for somebody to reproduce the experiments and get a different result. So they are. But people don't like that. They want to just say he's wrong because they know it can't be true. Because then causality is wrong, the science is wrong.
Is this the paper that was in the is this the same research paper that was in the newspapers only a couple of months ago?
It might have been.
Yeah. Yeah?
Yeah, it might have been.
There were people talking about his methodology.
Absolutely, but they really, he did it right.
Well, they said that he was doing it pretty poorly.
Okay, well, did they publish anything? I mean, I couldn't see anything wrong. I've got a copy of the paper. I'm going, it's 70 pages. What he's done is two things. One, he's time reversed, so he's taken standard psychological tests based on priming, where you're exposed to something and then you test it for it and you do better than someone who wasn't exposed to it previously. And he's time reversed it. And he's taken all their standard tests and then he's done them backwards and got a statistically significant result. And the people who are taking them apart say you need to change statistics to a different system than what we use in all of science at the moment. If you're going to change the rules for him, you have to change it for everybody. And there's a lot of pharmaceuticals on the market that are based on statistical significance, the same as what he's found. So I think it's likely he's found a hole in the scientific method where you might have to change the way we form conclusions from experiments. I think that's more likely than he's found that people are psychic and can see the future, but perhaps I'm wrong.
There have been other podcasts I've heard that have talked about his methodology being flawed. That's the only reason I say, that they pull him up on his methodology rather than the actual statistical side of things.
But that's not what you're saying.
Well, I'm saying that they're entitled to do that if they haven't read the paper or if they haven't tried to do it themselves. Yeah, we've got to close this off. It's up time for the next talk.
You mentioned unconditional belief. What about unconditional non-belief?
That's equal. It's equal.
What you just said means that as a non-believer, if some irrefutable proof of God's existence came along, would you accept it?
Of course.
If it was irrefutable and it met my standards, I would have to take it at a high probability.
So the same issue with Ben is he has reached some conclusion that all of us have a belief that can't possibly be true. But it has to be thrown out there and people have to redo the experiment.
If he's doing this following the scientific method rules, then they have to play the game.
So you might have to change your belief.
Absolutely.